Hey everyone, my name is Casper, your dragon monster philosopher, dragon monster epistemologist, and today I wanted to do a fun video on why you should study philosophy and how to study philosophy. So the video will be in two parts. I think I'll talk about the why first, but if you don't want to listen to the why, because if you're here, chances are you already want to study philosophy. In that case, just jump to the how. And I kind of already talked about why you should study philosophy. I think it makes you more human. I think it's part of being human. And also, one thing you'll discover as you study philosophy is that you'll end up studying the rest of the humanities because you can't really study philosophy as its own thing. You'll often find philosophers referring to art, referring to history, referring to anthropology, psychology, sociology, science. You can't study philosophy as its own thing. It requires an integration of all of these things, especially the humanities. Again, philosophy teaches you how to be human, and it also kind of gets into the how of studying philosophy because it requires a historical viewpoint. You can't just study a philosopher out of thin air. You have to know his time period, where he came from, what he's talking about in history. So, anyway, you should study philosophy because it makes you human, as I said, for I think the third time. But it really does make you human because a lot of the stuff out there, or when it comes to being a better person, or you see the self-help industry, which is literally $1 billion industry. It's huge. People spend money on therapy and self-help books, and they go to seminars and all of this stuff. And I think philosophy is the ultimate form of self-help because philosophy gets to the root and the core of your problems. Except I think the reason why self-help is so popular is that self-help kind of ignores the deeper questions of life and makes you more functional. It helps you function better. But if you find yourself running into problems, if you find yourself not very happy with therapy, philosophy opens up your life. Philosophy helps you feel so much better. And I'd like to refer you to my video on reflecting on the humanities because I think that captures a lot of the why you should study philosophy. So I kind of already talked about it, but philosophy can really help you show you where you're struggling. It can really help you question your viewpoints, really help you figure out what should I believe in my life? What should I do with my life? What should my passion be? What should my purpose be? And come to a real authentic purpose for your life and a real authentic understanding of your life. Because again, a lot of the stuff out there, especially in self-help or these political movements, they'll give you a purpose, they'll give you a meaning for your life, but I think it will be an empty purpose. It will be a purpose that is shallow and flimsy and will fall away because it doesn't have the philosophical structure and the grounding. And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, is that philosophy underlies everything. You can't study philosophy without studying other areas of knowledge. And these other areas of knowledge are kind of built like castles in the sky when they're separated from philosophy, because underlying every body of knowledge is these very fundamental questions of what makes a thing a thing. What is a consciousness? What is the self? What is the phenomena? That's phenomenology. Philosophy asks us these deep questions that can't be fully answered, and because they can't be fully answered, they And in some ways, philosophy, like if you want to know why you shouldn't study philosophy, it's because philosophy is going to leave you with a lot more questions. It's going to humble you and make you feel like you don't know what to think anymore. So that's kind of a downside of philosophy. But I feel like that downside of philosophy is really important. You need that humbling feeling. You need to feel that sense of wonder and the sense of not knowing, because if you go about the world in an arrogant way, as if you already know everything, you're going to run into a lot of problems. You're not going to see problems that are very much real and are there, and it'll be too late because you didn't deal with them early enough. So, philosophy, and by extension, literature, art, history, and the humanities, they help you solve problems or navigate the world in a way that is far more effective and useful. I would also say philosophy is a privilege in a lot of ways. Not everyone has time to sit around and study and to think. And I think it explains why there's so much evils in the world and why the world is honestly so chaotic and frightening sometimes. It's because people don't have the time to do philosophy. I mean, first of all, there's people who don't care about philosophy and they think it's a waste of time. And then there are people who just don't have the time to do philosophy. And so a lot of the problems, especially the political problems, um, on YouTube, the political debates, all of the fighting, all of the wars, all of the greed, all of the corruption, I think all of that can be explained with the lack of philosophy. If people were more philosophical, a lot of these problems just wouldn't exist because people would be operating from a higher perspective. They'd be operating from a more humane perspective. So, I mean, when I think about all of the problems in the world, how do we solve world hunger? How do we solve sadness? How do we solve whatever? It's with philosophy. And philosophy also teaches you that not all problems can be solved. Sadness is not a problem to be solved. Happiness is not something that you can just achieve and be done with. Philosophy is about asking questions of like, how do we navigate sadness instead of trying to destroy it? How do we how do we what do we do when life isn't perfect? What do we do when our dreams aren't achieved? What do we do when we go off track? So, again, philosophy is like self help on steroids because it asks the questions that no one wants to ask that are very important. And in a weird way, just by asking the right questions, it solves a lot of the problems that we're facing in the world today. The other reason why you should study philosophy is that you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So there's a lot of people who sometimes they take drugs, or they're really up late at night with their friend and they start getting really philosophical with their questions. And the there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's great. And it's a sign that philosophy will enter your life at some point, especially if you run into a crisis or something. But without studying philosophy, you can kind of end up asking questions that people have already asked a long time ago. If you read Plato or Aristotle or Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or whatever of these philosophers, they've already asked the questions that you're asking late at night with your friend. Not only did they ask these questions, but they asked these questions in a much deeper way and they answered them in a much more profound way because they're geniuses. And they did it in a time period when these questions arose. So you might thinking that, when you ask the question, what is the meaning of my life? Those kinds of questions arose in the 1800s when existentialism became a thing with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and proto existentialism became a thing with Kant and Hegel and even Max Stirner and Schopenhauer. So a lot of these questions people were already facing hundreds of years ago, and that can really help you feel grounded, and also it makes you feel better because you're not alone in this. And again, studying philosophy helps you not reinvent the wheel when it comes to ideas. When you read all of the philosophers, or if you really understand the conversation of philosophy, you can start asking real questions, or you know where humanity is at. Because when people ask what is the meaning of my life, I feel so purposeless. Well, there are so many great answers to that question. There are so many different philosophers who provided so many different ways of going about this. Again, with Kierkegaard and his faith, or Nietzsche and the Superman, or Camus and the absurd, and Simone de Beauvoir, and um, so there's so many existentialist philosophers who have already kind of answered this question. They didn't close the question. They didn't give the end all be all, but they certainly provided a way forward when it comes to what is the meaning of my life and what should I do with my life. So studying philosophy gets you updated on what humans have actually achieved with knowledge, and this allows you to come up with truly original and innovative insights. You're not going to be able to provide anything new to the philosophical conversation, especially if you want to change the world, if you want to make the world a better place, if you want to contribute to human knowledge. You're not going to be able to do it unless you understand the philosophers of the past, because you're just going to go in circles. You're going to say what people have already said before. You're going to talk about things that people have already discussed. So it would be kind of a waste of your time. Maybe not to yourself, but to everybody else. People would already see what you're saying and they'd move on. So, and I think the final thing why you should study philosophy is that I think if you compare like all of the other pleasures, like having sex or eating good food or listening to music or whatever, I think philosophical contemplation, I think thinking ideas for its own sake, I believe Aristotle said this, is one of the greatest joys and pleasures there are. Just to think, just to kind of contain the world in your mind and to think about the world in these very deep ways is just enjoyable and pleasurable and fun. And that's why you should study philosophy. It's a pleasure that you can't find anywhere else. It's a personal pleasure that is it's unmatched by anything else because it's so deep. So that's why you should study philosophy. How should you study philosophy? Well, and I think people go about this in a very rigid and step by step way. And I just want to make it clear there is no perfect ultimate way to study philosophy. There's a lot of different ways you can study philosophy. And in my opinion, first, you should just see philosophy what it is. And I see philosophy as a huge conversation that is taking place over literally thousands of years. And so you have the pre-Socratics, like the Taoists and the Confucianists and Heraclitus, who were asking these very deep questions and coming up with these simplistic answers, or these not very clear answers. And then we get Plato, who a lot of people say is the basis of all philosophy. So if you don't know where to start philosophically, if you don't know how to study philosophy, I would recommend just start reading Plato and his dialogues. His dialogues are very fun and engaging, but they're also very deep, and they ask the fundamental questions that philosophers have been dealing with for thousands of years. So Plato is a really great place to start, in my opinion. But again, philosophy is this huge conversation. I like to think of it as all of these ghosts of the past. When you read a book, when you open up a book by a philosopher, and again, when you study philosophy, you're also studying the rest of the humanities. So you're not just reading philosophers, you're reading literature, you're reading classic literature, you're reading the Bible, you're reading ancient texts if you can. And that's another thing with translation. I'll get to that. But you're reading a lot of different obscure texts and about a bunch of different cultures. You're not just reading philosophers. So there's this huge conversation that is taking place. And it starts with Plato asking a lot of the fundamental questions. And then you have Aristotle who starts to assert these answers. And this is a very general overview of philosophy, but I'm just kind of fleshing it out. In other words, when you study philosophy, I recommend just getting a summary of each of the great philosophers of the past. You should just get a good summary. What were their basic what was the basic message behind what they were saying? Because when you look at this huge philosophical conversation, because philosophers refer back to each other. Nietzsche refers to Plato, he refers to Kant, who came before Nietzsche. Schopenhauer refers to Kant. And Kant was a huge influence. Like so many philosophers refer to Kant. So this is why I see it as a philosophical conversation. These philosophers, they're not talking into the void. There's a huge link between all of these ideas, and they're all arguing with each other, and they're all debating with each other. So when you open up a text by Nietzsche, not only is he having a kind of conversation with himself because writing is solitary by nature, but he's, in a sense, he's having this kind of this, because writing and literature is this amazing technology, he's kind of having a conversation with Immanuel Kant 100 years later. Like there's this dialogue between Kant and Nietzsche, or there's this dialogue between Schopenhauer and Kant. And so you can kind of see this ghostly literature in many ways, and philosophy is like calling upon ghosts. You're summoning ghosts of the past, and you're watching in a very clear image the conversation that's taking place. You're seeing a debate happen. You're watching a conversation, and then a couple years later you're seeing another conversation, and then a couple years later you're seeing another conversation. And so you start to just see this huge, just all of these ideas evolving and shifting and interplaying off of each other. And that's essentially what philosophy is. And so when you see this philosophical conversation, I recommend just kind of getting a bird's eye perspective view of it. Like, what is actually going on here? What did Plato and Aristotle start? And what did the Stoics say? And what did the Epicureans say? And what did the early Christians say? And then what did Aquinas say? And what did the German idealists say? What did Kant say? What did the postmodernists say? So get a summary of all of these different ideas, and then ask yourself, what do I find interesting about these conversations? Because when you have a bird's eye view, you kind of have a pixelated image, or you just see such a wide perspective. But all of these conversations can get so deep and so detailed and so intricate. And that's another thing. Like, how do I read philosophy when these books are so sophisticated and so detailed and so hard to read? And this is why I think you should go with what do you find interesting? What is a philosopher that jumps out to you? For example, when I got into philosophy, I started with Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, for a lot of people, is actually a gateway to philosophy, because a lot of people, they're kind of struggling with life, but they kind of want a self-help, but a deep self-help. So they read Ayn Rand, and Ayn Rand is this very rational philosopher, and she makes everything easily understandable and connected and unified. So a lot of people are like, oh yeah, Ayn Rand is my favorite philosopher. And that's how they get into philosophy. But over time, they might discover that Ayn Rand has holes in her philosophy. Her philosophy actually doesn't answer all of the questions. Ayn Rand actually asserts and assumes a lot of things that a lot of philosophers have been discussing for thousands of years. And so then you move into other philosophers. For example, you might then find Nietzsche really interesting because Nietzsche actually wanted to face the void instead of just ignoring it like Ayn Rand. So Nietzsche is this more individualist. He's still an individualist like Ayn Rand, but he has a whole new way of looking at things. And you can even start to look, you can start to ask yourself questions that are more interesting, like what would Ayn Rand think about Nietzsche? And how did these philosophers disagree with each other? And that might be a conversation that you're really interested in exploring. And then for me, for example, what made me leave Ayn Rand and what got me to read other philosophers is from reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is a classic literary novel. This is why I think literature, classic literature, goes hand in hand with philosophical texts and psychology texts and all of this stuff. You can't just separate them. I think they're constantly interplaying off of each other. And so after reading Frankenstein, that's what made me stop believing in objectivism. And it got me really interested in monster epistemology or questions around epistemology and monsters. Monsters became what I was fascinated about. So when I study philosophy, how I study philosophy, and as an example for you, when you study philosophy, you should ask yourself questions that you find interesting and then go into philosophical conversations that are discussing the exact questions that you find interesting. So, for example, Immanuel Kant is very important because he talks about the sublime. Why is the sublime important? It's very important when it comes to discussing monsters and monster epistemology. So I've been very fascinated and have gone about reading Kant by finding certain passages where he talks about the sublime. So I got an overview of Kant, a basic summary of what he was about, a biography, his history, how he stands in history, and then I go into actual specific books where he wrote about the sublime. I don't read the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant front to back, because that would be a waste of my time. That would be very hard and difficult, and it would suck all of the life out of philosophy. Because Kant, again, if you look at the context, he is an academic referring to past academics. And he goes into all of these conversations with philosophers that are not really that interesting to me. His philosophical project in general is very interesting to me, but the basic detailed conversations and how he, again, because he's a philosopher and he's trying to defend his ideas, he has to go in painstaking detail about all of his arguments and how he proves himself. But if you live in the modern day, you can kind of see already where Kant is wrong, and you don't need to go into his specific arguments. But if you're studying the sublime and monsters, getting a very detailed, refined image of the conversation where he's talking about the sublime, that is actually worth reading. That is worth opening up the book and reading the passages and quoting the text. And then I think that is the proper way to do philosophy, because you can't study everything. You can't, especially like if you try to read the Critique of Pure Reason from front to back, it'll literally take you at least a year. And even after that year, will you even understand it? And then there's all of these different translations of the philosophers, right? Because the Critique of Pure Reason, it was written in German. It wasn't written in English. So there's already a disconnect there. If you read the English version, you're not going to get the full thing. So you kind of just have to accept that with philosophy, is that you're kind of like a bird, you're a falcon, or an eagle, and you're flying around. You're flying around over the philosophical conversation, and you're kind of like going in and getting a worm or a squirrel. Find the squirrels in the philosophical conversation, and then it kind of just don't ignore the rest, but just get secondary sources to understand it. Because there are some people, when they go into philosophy, they're just like, okay, I'm going to start with Plato and read all of his dialogues, and then I'm going to read Aristotle, and then I'm going to read the Stoics. And to me, that is such a boring and flat way, and you're not going to retain anything. You're not going to be Philosophy is not going to be excited if you're reading a Christian philosopher. For example, when I was really into Ayn Rand, Christian philosophers like St. Augustine just sounded ridiculous. And if I read St. Augustine, I would be so bored to tears out of my mind. But once I started to getting into monsters, St. Augustine actually is very interesting and exciting for me, because I remember hearing from a summary of St. Augustine that monsters were messengers of God, which is a very interesting. So I'm actually planning to go into Augustine and read that section where he talks about how monsters are messengers of God, because that applies directly to what I'm interested in. That deals with the questions that I'm fascinated with. And I think that's the proper way to do philosophy, if there is a proper way. You should read philosophers based on interest. And it's the same with like Foucault or Derrida. Like, Derrida wrote so many books. I mean, I think he wrote literally 100 books. But I'll be honest with you, I don't think I need to read all of those books to understand his philosophical project. And I think I only need to read Spectres of Marx, especially as someone who's interested in monsters, because that's where he talks about hauntology. So I only need to read a few sections of the Spectres of Marx to really get what I need from hauntology and to make my argument and to contribute philosophically in the conversation. And again, this is what everyone does. And so I think you should just get a philosophical overview, get a summary of all of the philosophers to kind of get a grasp of what everyone is kind of talking about. Kind of like, you can hear philosophers in another room over here. Then there's the philosophical conversation in front of you. And then there's a philosophical conversation over there that you can't even hear, but it's there. So just kind of like walk around the philosophical conversation and just listen in on conversations that are worth listening to for you. And some conversations will be so boring and dry, and other conversations will be really loud and annoying and will be trying to grab your attention, which are the political debates on YouTube. Those will act like they are the authority and what they're talking about is really important, when it's actually these ancient texts and these 100-year-long conversations that are far more important. So, and then the last thing I want to say is that philosophy is a journey. So you're going to be changing your mind a lot. And I think you should be changing your mind. And, you're going to go through stages. You're going to go through, if you read Ayn Rand, you're going to go through an objectivist stage. And right now I'm in a monster stage. And then afterwards I might find something completely different. I don't know, a Taoism stage. You're going to go through stages. Your thinking is going to evolve and change. And I think that's good. I think you should flow with it. And because if you're someone who is committed to only one philosopher and you think they're the absolute, and that's another thing, when you start to really understand the philosophical conversation, you start to realize that there is no one right philosopher. There isn't the best philosopher. There are different philosophers with their strengths, with their weaknesses, and they're providing different answers or solutions to the fundamental philosophical questions. Like when you deal with existentialism and the death of God, or how God isn't actually something you can know rationally, different philosophers have different answers to that. Nietzsche just says, well, you can't know God, so woo, we can do whatever we want now, because the underlying moral structure is gone. So morals is what we make of them. And then Kierkegaard says, well, we should have faith in God now. This is where faith truly becomes important as a Christian, because you can't know God rationally. And then Dostoevsky, who is not a philosopher, but he's very important to the philosophical conversation, has his own thing on God and how the loss of God is actually really bad. And then there's the utilitarians who have this very rational and logical approach to morality, and they don't even take seriously the death of God the way Nietzsche does. They just act like the death of God is like, oh yeah, that's just rationality doing its process. Now let's find a rational morality. And so you can see the debate just between utilitarians and Nietzsche and modern day Democrats. And so, anyway, there's just a lot of different solutions and a lot of different ways of going about these questions. And to me, just seeing the different answers and seeing how different philosophers respond to each other and how they come up with unique ideas from very, very different perspectives, right? Even though Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are answering the same question, they go about answering that question in opposite ways. And they're both geniuses and they're so profound. And it's just so exciting to see two powerful minds go at it at each other over their works with their writing. It's again, it goes back to why should you study philosophy? It's just because contemplation and looking at different ideas is it's so exciting. It's so amazing. It makes you feel like how is it possible that these people can have such convincing answers for things, but being saying something completely different. It's amazing. It really is awe-inducing. So that's it. That's why you should study philosophy and how to study philosophy. Thank you for listening.